Okay, we're ready to get started, so let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we're thankful today, as always, that you've given us your word as a lamp before our feet to guide us on the path. Lord, I pray tonight as we open again your word that you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my mouth to speak those things that you would have to be said, and anoint our hearts to receive that you have for each one. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're continuing in our study of the Gospels, and we're in the period 3, which was a ministry to the multitudes in Galilee. So we're going to pick up with the journey across the sea, and as, of course, remember now that the Gospels are not in order, so we're trying to put them in chronological order is what we're doing. So you may be jumping back and forth in Matthew, particularly Matthew, when we get into this 8th, 9th, 10th, up to the 13th chapter, are all out of whack compared to what the other Gospel writers write in terms of order. And remember, of course, he's writing from a Jewish perspective. He's telling, what he's doing is telling short stories, and those are not necessarily in chronological order. So that's kind of the way you have to look at Matthew. He's presenting things that are important to him from a Jewish aspect in the form of short stories. All right, so let's pick up tonight. We're going to start Matthew chapter 8, beginning with verse 18, and we'll go through verse 27. By the way, you have, I think, 8 pages of notes tonight. A lot of notes, but they're most of it reading, so don't get too excited. We'll get out of here in less than 3 hours. All right, Matthew chapter 8. And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Then another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Now then, he got into a boat. His disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." But he said to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be, that even the winds of the sea obey him?" Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41 cover this event. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in a boat as he was, and other little boats were also with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And now Luke chapter 8, beginning with verse 22. Now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples. And he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. But he said to them, Where is your faith? And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him. All right, so this is probably one of the better known situations that Jesus was in. Now, the better known stories. Here he was preaching. Now, remember, he'd just been preaching to the multitudes. They had been on the Capernaum side of the Sea of Galilee. You remember he'd gone through the parables. He'd explained why he taught in parables. And so the question is, why, when he saw the multitudes, did he decide to leave? He'd been over there teaching. Well, probably he was through teaching. I mean, he told them everything he wanted to tell them. And you remember he explained that he was speaking in parables so that they would hear and not hear, see and not see. He didn't, in other words, because of their hard-heartedness, they couldn't understand the true meaning of his stories. And that's why he spoke in parables. They would never have the excuse of saying, we never heard. He presented it to them. They should have been able to understand it, but because of their inattentiveness, I'll put it that way, to the meanings of God's word prior to that. The teachers, the scribes, not understanding what the law was really all about, that it should have generated a change in the heart rather than just an outward thing. They never caught the real depths. You know, they just didn't get the gist of what was going on. Okay, they just saw the outside, and because of that, all they heard were the good stories. It was interesting. It was like the newest TV program. Everybody wants to watch it. You know. He came to town and he was entertaining, and so they could come and be entertained with his stories and be amazed at what he could do. It was like the magician who comes to town with a magic act and puts on a magic act, and that's the way they treated him. Even his disciples, I think, to some degree, based on what we're going to see tonight. So here they were, he was teaching, and then he decided that he wanted to go to the other side of the lake. And I kind of can picture in my mind, you know, here he is, he's been teaching, they've been sitting in the house, and he was explaining to his disciples, you know, why he'd been preaching in parables, because remember they were in the house. And it says that when Jesus saw the great multitudes outside the house, that's where they had been outside the house. And it was becoming evening, toward the evening, that he decided, let's go across the other side. And as they got out of the house, and I can see him walking out of the house, and there's all this multitude out there, they're wanting him, of course, to do some more miracles and tell us some more stories. And he's walking out of the house, and a scribe came up to him. Now this scribe may very well have been a member of the Sanhedrin, we don't know, but he was evidently a disciple of Jesus. In other words, a learner from Jesus. He was one that had been there, been listening to his teaching. And he comes up and says, Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go. Man, I'll be right there. And you know, it's funny, I look back over the years, and you see a lot of people come into the church. And I've noticed it for years and years. When I have somebody come into the church that'll stand up and say, bless God, I've been saying I'm going to follow Jesus no matter what. And I have made the comment, and unfortunately, more times than not, I'm right, that this person isn't going to last very long. You know, and the reason is because there's enthusiasm. They see Jesus doing great things. They come in, they get saved, they feel great, and man, they're ready to conquer the world. I'm going to follow Jesus. Man, nothing's going to stop me. As soon as you say that, guess who comes along? And he's right there to whack you upside the head and pull you right back out. And if you're doing this in your own, this is my thing. I am going to serve God no matter what. You can't do that on your own. You have to rely upon God in order to serve Him. There is a reliance in every part of life, and when you start saying, I can do this, you fall into problems. It's one of the things that I mentioned it before, but contemporary music writers, most of the songs seem to be songs of admonition. In other words, I can do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to change this. It's in strength, and I'm going to show this and that. And it's kind of like saying to God, God, here I am. I'm really somebody, and I'm ready to do things. Or if you listen to the older songs, they talked about, through the grace of God, I can do this. And because of Him, I can do this. He lives, and because He lives, I live. Rather than, I can really, And so these kinds of attitudes can oftentimes, while they're great, to see, and you want people to be enthused, you also want them to understand that it is not in their own strength. It is not in what they do. They must rely on God to get anywhere with Him. So look at what Jesus said to him. He said, foxes have holes, and the birds in the air, they fly, they have nests. But the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay His head. Now this has been kind of a strange, it's a strange statement. Hi Jeff, come on in. It's a strange statement if you look at it just strictly as Him saying, I don't have any place to lay a head. Because we know He stayed in homes. We know He had a house in Capernaum. He had a place to stay. It wasn't that He was a hobo just running around the country. He always had some place to stay, and friends, or His own house, or His mother's house. He had a house. So why did He say He did not have a place to lay His head? I think the answer to that is in the fact that He said this, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay His head. The only reference to the Son of Man that's made in the Gospels is by Jesus. Nobody else said about Him, He's the Son of Man. Now we see it in Revelation and we see it in Acts where it's referring to the Son of Man. This goes into the difference between the Son of Man and the Son of God. As the Son of God, His divinity, He had mansions, He had everything the Father had, He had heaven. Right? But as the Son of Man, on this earth, He was only here as a sojourner, as a pilgrim, walking through this earth. Now that concept is not new. Think about Abraham. We've talked about it in here many times. Here's Abraham, one of the greatest men that ever lived, really, one of the richest probably that ever lived. He had everything, and yet he never settled down anywhere. And the reason is because he was busy trying to find a city whose builder and maker was God. He said, I'm not here just to settle down. I'm only a pilgrim here. I'm only walking through this place. And we can talk about the fact everywhere he stepped, that was his. God said, everywhere you step, that's yours. Man, yeah, he was busy walking because that went to his generations after him. But he was a sojourner. He didn't have a place to lay his head in the context that Jesus was talking about here. So what he was saying to this scribe is, oh, you want to follow me? You want to go wherever I go? Then you have to be a pilgrim on this earth. You cannot put your stake down in the ground in the law, in the synagogue, in the temple, none of that stuff. You have to be willing to follow me as a pilgrim. Boy, that strikes home for us today, doesn't it? How many people are so concerned about their daily lives that they forget that we're only here for a short time. Our job here is not to become famous, have a nice house and all. I mean, if you can get that, that's fine, that's good. but our attitude, our frame of our mind has to be that I am only here to serve God, to follow God. He was just a pilgrim. I have to be just a pilgrim. My number one, top of the list has to be serve God, follow Him. Okay. Now there's another man came to him, and notice it says another of his disciples. So we know the scribe was considered a disciple because another disciple. This probably was not one of the 12, but this is just somebody who was a learner following him. He came and he said, I want to go with you, but I got to go bury my father first. And Jesus makes a statement that's really, in one sense, kind of hard, you know. He just says, let the dead bury their dead. You come and follow me. Now that's pretty hard. Let the dead bury the dead. And when you look at it from their culture, you know, burying your father, a close relative like that, was a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal. It was like, you know, there's a commercial on television you see for a cold medicine, I think, or something, you know, where the guy's standing there, you see him, and he says, I'm sorry, but I've got this call. I'm just going to have to take the day off. And they pan back, and he's standing there next to his daughter who's ready to get married. You know, I just have to take the day off. The burying the dead in those days was like a big wedding ceremony would be today. And they spent a lot of money on their funerals. They hired weepers and mourners. They hired musicians. They hired all of this stuff to go through this long process of mourning, and then they would take the body of the deceased one, put it in a tomb or a grave that they had purchased. So, I mean, it was a big thing. And here Jesus says, let the dead bury their dead. You come and follow me. That's a hard saying. And what did Jesus really mean by that? He certainly didn't mean that the dead person should come out of the graves and bury themselves, you know, or you know, that wasn't what he had in mind at all. Yeah. And yet, well, we won't go into that. We'll be here all night. But what he was saying here, who were the dead? The dead were those under the law. The dead were those that were so wrapped up in their traditions that they couldn't break free and be alive. And here was a disciple saying to Jesus, I have to go bury my dead, my father. And Jesus, again, using the opportunity to teach as he has done over and over again, he looks at him and says, let the dead bury the dead. Let those under the law who are wrapped up in the traditions and the culture and the ethics of their world that tells them what they have to do, let them go bury the dead. You come and follow me. What is he saying there without saying it? You come follow me because I have life. Let the dead bury the dead. You come and partake of life, not of death. Okay, now he didn't say that, but you see the reasoning behind that assumption. Without saying so, he said, I am life. And of course, what did John say about him? He is life. And he is the light of the world. Life and light. Okay, so we deal with these two. Now, he went out and got in the boat. Verse 23. It says, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Now, this, I've heard people say, well, it was one of those little fishing boats. It may have been a fishing boat, but it wasn't a little fishing boat, because he had all 12 of his disciples in there with him, plus himself. That's 13 people. So it wasn't a little dinghy. This was a pretty good sized boat. Probably had 2 sails, and it may have been a fishing boat of some kind, but more than likely it was a kind of boat that you would use to go from one side of the lake to the other, like a ferry boat or a cargo boat of some kind. I would say it was probably more like that. Also, the little fishing boats were open. You know, they were like an oversized rowboat with a sail in the middle. And yet look what happened here. Now when he got into his boat, his disciples followed him, and suddenly a great tempest came up. They had no sooner pushed off from shore, the wind started blowing, and pretty soon that sea started whipping around, and it was billowing up. It was bad. It was bad. The boat started filling up with water. And you know, the disciples, of course, most of them were fishermen, had been out in the water. They were terrified of what was going on. This wasn't just a little breeze blowing out there. It was kind of like what hit us a couple of days ago. I mean, the wind was blowing and these waves were rolling, and here they are in the boat, and it says that the boat was covered with waves. Covered with waves. These waves were breaking over the top. And also, by the way, notice in verse 36 of Mark, it says they took him along in the boat as he was. He didn't have a raincoat. He didn't have extra blankets. He was just as he was. He went and got in the boat. And other little boats were also with him. And I've often wondered, we read the story of this, you know, the panic that was going on in the big boat. What about those little boats? These were his followers, probably, who were determined to follow him. So they piled into all these little boats, and they're headed out, and that storm hit. I wonder what they were doing.
Praying?
Oh, yeah, they were probably going crazy back there. I mean, if his disciples, who had been with him and seen all the miracles, if they were, you know, terrified in the big boat, what were these poor guys doing in the little boats? Oh, they must have really been in some kind of shape, right? All right, so what happened? And notice it says in Mark that the waves beat into the boat, so it was already filling. It was already filling up with water. And so what were the disciples doing? You ever thought about what they were doing?
Probably using the buckets.
Yeah, they were probably bailing the water out, right? Yeah, you know, they were doing, one guy, he was trying to keep the sails going, and somebody else was steering, and they were bailing water for all they were worth, and the boat was still filling up. They couldn't keep up. Boat's filling up. Finally, somebody decided, you know, we probably better go get Jesus. So they came to him. Now, it says here that he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. Now, this is another reason why I think it had to be a big boat. If he was in a little boat, in the back of a rowboat, and the rowboat's filling up with water, and the winds, he would not be sleeping on a pillow. He'd be off of that pillow. I mean, you know, unless the angels were sitting there holding his pillow for him. And sleeping would have been very difficult in that situation, you know. But if you're in a cargo boat and you're in the stern, you're covered, you're probably in a little cabin affair, and sleeping on a dry pillow. And that would make sense. He was asleep. So they came and they woke him up. And it's interesting here, this whole story to me becomes very, very interesting. In Matthew he says, they woke him saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And Mark says, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And Luke says that they said, "Master, Master, we are perishing." Now, my question is, what did they expect Jesus to do? We know the end of the story, right? Mm-hmm. But what did they expect Jesus to do? Have you ever thought about that? Did they really expect him to calm the storm? Or were they expecting him to some way miraculously turn them all into fish so they had lungs to breathe underwater? You know, that probably would have, you know. Or were they just expecting him to get up there and bail water with them? What was they looking for Jesus to do? Or did they just want some encouragement? You know, hey Jesus, you know, we're perishing, at least you can be awake while we all die. it's just an interesting question. What did they expect Jesus to do? Well, what he did was, this is one of those areas where Matthew says he talked to him first, and Mark and Luke, they both say he spoke to him afterwards, but in either case, it doesn't matter. He got up and rebuked the wind and the sea. Now you stop and think about it, rebuking the wind would have stopped the sea. But he rebuked both the wind and the sea. So he stopped the wind and he stopped the waves. He stopped the water that was coming into the boat. He stopped everything and it became still. And they go on to say, in a great calm. Great calm. And Jesus said to them, he said, why do you marvel? Where's your faith? Why is it that you are so afraid? How come you're afraid? Well, Jesus, we're about to die. Okay, so why are you afraid? You see, this whole story, including the scribe and including the other disciple, they kind of run together. Jesus says, when you look at it, hey, we're just traveling through here. I just got done telling you, when I talked to the scribe and I talked to the disciple, that we are just traveling through, and I am the light that's taking you through. And you're worried about dying? If you die today, you die. If you die in 10 years, you still die. If you die in 100 years, you still die. Point being, why are you afraid of dying? You know, we don't see that in this, and I'm sure you can pull all kinds of things out of this, But to me, what he's saying is, why are you afraid of dying when you are with me and I am life? Whether I'm asleep or whether I'm awake, it doesn't matter. If we all perish, but we have life. He was not, I don't think, addressing the fact that they were afraid of the winds and the waves. We sometimes think we should just not be afraid of sickness and not be afraid of things when they come our way. I don't think Jesus was dealing at that level. I think he was dealing at a level underneath that. Sure, we're going to be afraid of things that happen to us in the natural. We're human, we're natural, and we're going to have these emotional things that happen to us. And we can get peace in that. And we can go through those things, but there's still going to be a fear. I've talked with people and hear people that, well, I don't know why, I'm a Christian, but I'm just so afraid of this cancer or whatever it is. Fear isn't the issue of the cancer. Fear is that you're afraid of what's going to happen afterwards. Are you really afraid of dying? If you can get past that point of saying, I'm not afraid to die, then the cancer ceases to be a fear. Or the heart trouble ceases to be a fear. Or whatever it is that you're afraid of. Once you have established who you are and where you're going, it ceases to be a fear. At least, on the spiritual side is what I'm talking about. Not the emotional side. I'm talking about the spiritual side. And that's what Jesus was talking about. Verse 27 of Matthew says, so the men marveled, saying, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? Verse 41 of Mark says, and they feared exceedingly and said to one another, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? And then in Luke it says, in verse 25, but he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. Now, we've seen the word fear many times, haven't we? And it means awe or reverence, but not this time. Both Mark and Luke use the word fear. That word fear, that doesn't mean awestruck. It is the word phobio. Phobio, from where we get phobias, claustrophobia and so on. Which means to fear exceedingly. Like you have claustrophobia, that kind of fear. That is a terrifying fear that will freeze you. Remember, my dad used to have a fear of heights, and I did too for years. But I can remember when I was a kid, we had a house down in California, single level house. Now, the eaves were only 8 feet tall. That's about as high as, not even as high as the ceiling. And I can remember my dad trying to paint the house, and he put the ladder up against it. He would get back, and I've seen him make a run at the ladder with his bucket and his brush. He would hit the 3rd step, and boom! That was it. He could not go 3 steps up the ladder. Freeze, right there, boom, that was it. Oh, there were some funny stories. We had a 2-story house up in north central California, and it had a water cooler. Well, he could go out the window onto the porch roof and then lay up on the roof, and he'd get up there and then he could fix it. And so he was up there fixing it when I was there one day, and he couldn't get down. I had to go up and literally pull his legs over the edge and pull him off, and he was as stiff as a board, lock solid. I had to pull him down off, bend his legs, and get him to, he got down on the porch roof and get him through the window. Extreme fear. Pastor talks about his fear of claustrophobia. I've been working on the office. I took the door out and that window and stuff into the lobby. And we were laughing Sunday. I says, I hope when I put that paint on there, everything, it doesn't make you claustrophobic in here. And he says, that might be. He's in the office. Oh, wow. I said, you may have to open the drapes. Look outside. Extreme fear of something. And that's what the disciples were, extremely fearful of what? Of Jesus. What? Yeah. Read it. Read it. It says, when there was perfect calm, they feared exceedingly and said to one another, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? They were terrified. Who is this guy we've been walking around with all this time? Whoa! I mean, he can heal the sick, and we get that. That's okay. But when he walks out into a hurricane and says, peace be still, and everything stops, and the wind stops blowing, and the waves stop beating right now, and it's calm, who have we been traveling with? It wasn't awe, it wasn't reverence, it was downright fear. That's why I go back to the question, why did they wake Jesus? What were they expecting? See, when we ask God for things, Pastor preached a sermon Sunday. I thought it was fantastic. How big is your God? To them, God was big enough to heal. God was big enough, to lead us around and to be a fantastic teacher and do all of these things. They didn't realize he was big enough to control nature, to stop a hurricane. See? And when he did it, and they realized his power, they became petrified or feared, terrified at who he really was. And I think we sometimes need to get to that point that we become terrified when we realize who Jesus really is. It needs to shock us. It needs to terrify us when we feel and understand the power that he has. And then what should really shake us up is when he said, we have that same power. Why don't we? How big is our God? Great sermon Sunday. All right, let's move ahead. Oh boy. All right, let's move into the healing, the Gargesian demoniac. So we pick up the story where they're out on the lake now, and he has calmed the winds, and they proceed to the other side. I would love to have been the proverbial fly on the wall during the rest of that journey. What did they talk to Jesus about? I mean, they were petrified. I mean, they were terrified. Did they they allow him to go back to bed? They're going to sit in the bow. We're going to go up the front of the boat. We'll leave him in the back. There's something with this guy. I don't want, I got to be up in the front. Or did they say, okay, you got to explain what's going on here? And I'm sure there was a conversation with a tremendous amount of depth about what it means to be divine and what it means to be human. There had to have been that kind of a conversation that went on. But at any rate, they crossed the lake and they came to the other side. And Matthew covers the story in chapter 8, verses 28 to 34. When he had come to the other side, to the country of the Gergesens, I hate that word. There met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, what have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, if you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. And he said to them, go. So then when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. Then those who kept them fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadareans. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, what have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me. For he said to him, come out of the man, unclean spirit. Then he asked him, what is your name? And he answered, saying, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly that he would not send him out of the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, send us to the swine, that we may enter them. And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea, and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled and told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who saw him told them how it happened to him, who had been demon-possessed, and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends, and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim it in Decapolis, all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. Now Luke covers the story in chapter 8, verses 26 to 39. Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. And he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice says, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for he had often seized him. And he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles, and he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And he begged him that he would not command them to go into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain, so they begged him that he would permit them to enter them, and he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what happened, they fled and told it to the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what had happened and came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had departed sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. They also who had seen it told them by what means he who had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you." And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. Now, here we see Jesus. He just stopped the wind and the waves and all this. And his disciples are probably still shook up over this whole thing. They land, and before Jesus can even step out of the boat, all right, here comes, now Matthew says 2, and Mark and Luke say 1. Demon-possessed man. Now, why is there a difference between 2 and 1? Well, most scholars feel that this is the same event. It only happened the one time. But what they're saying is there may have been even more, but what Jesus addressed, or what Mark and Luke addressed, was that one of them was the guy who was the most. He was so demon-possessed, he would break chains, and this was the story they were telling. There may have been 1 or 2 more, who knows, that were also demon-possessed. They probably expelled them out to the tombs when they became in this condition. So here they come down the hill, and probably there was 2 of them. They come down the hill to Jesus, and as soon as they get within range of Jesus, they start crying out. There's some interesting things here in this story. you know, there's just a lot of things. You know, we could spend half the night just looking at different things that we could explore here. But the thing to notice is, number one, the demons in all three situations called out and said, what do we have to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? They all three recognized who Jesus was. Now, this is interesting when you take it in the context of the disciples just hours before on the lake. Jesus was a healer. Jesus was a great teacher. But they did not recognize Jesus for who he really was, or they would not have been terrified when he stopped the wind and the waves. What the demoniacs were saying is that you are the Son of God. You are divine. They recognized who Jesus was. Secondly, they wanted to know, and it's couched differently the way the writers wrote it, but I'm going to paraphrase. What are you here for us for? Why are you here to bother us? They said, what do we have to do with you? In other words, why are you here to bother us? We're not bothering you. I'm, filling in the. We're not bothering you. We're not even in your country. We're over here in the region of Decapolis, which was made up of 13 cities, and these were free state cities. In other words, they didn't belong to anybody really. They had been inserted by Rome and encouraged by Rome, but they had their own forms of government, and they were along, and it was called the region of Decapolis. So there was 13 of these cities. Syria being one of them, by the way, that had become part of this Decapolis idea where they had their own rulers. They said, we're not even in your country. We're over here minding our own business, and we possess these guys. That's our job. That's what we do. So why are you over here to bother us? Huh? Have you come over here to torment us before the time? You see, there's not a demon in hell that doesn't know what their end is. They all know what their end is. The devil knows what his end is. So, we sometimes think, we got to be careful because we don't want the devil to know what his end is. Now, I've heard prophecy teachers, say, well, these demons, if they really knew, what would they do different? They can't get saved. What are they going to do? What they always do, and just wait until it happens, Wreak as much havoc as they can. But they knew what was going to happen to them, and they knew that it was not time for that to happen. I've heard people preach, all the demons, they have no sense of when the time is, a prophecy is. Yes, they do. They know exactly when it's going to happen. They didn't know who Jesus was when he was born, or they wouldn't have, the Satan probably would not have crucified him. He knew he was a son of God, but he didn't know what he was here for. He didn't know that killing the man would bring about salvation and the loss of death, hell, and the grave for the devil. He didn't get that part of it. It's kind of like the Jews. He had ears to hear and eyes to see. He reads the Word just like he knows the Word of God probably better than any of us. But he didn't get it. He didn't get it. So, they knew what their deal was. Also, where is it? In Mark, or Luke, I mean. Verse 31, and they begged him that he would not command them to go into the abyss. In Mark, he says to leave this country. It's the same idea. They know their final resting place is going to be in the abyss, hell, in torment. And they said, Jesus, why are you here, to bother us? Have you come to torment us before it's time to be tormented? Have you changed the timetable? Are you here to throw us into the abyss now? In fact, just to command us to go. You see the power in the words of these demons? These are supernatural demons that have so much power that they serve the devil, who is the ruler of this world, who has power over the world. They have tremendous amount of power, and yet they're saying, did you come to command us to go into the abyss? Did you come with Michael and all the angels to bind us all up and throw us in? No. You want to know how much power Jesus has? They couldn't even go into the swine without asking for his permission. Wow. Wow. Now this is spiritual warfare at its height. You don't get any more warfare than what Jesus was doing right here. And yet he didn't even raise a sweat. I mean, it wasn't even like he was halfway concerned. Hey, Jesus, are you here to command us to go into the abyss? Oh, you see these demons? I can just see them. Oh, the demons. Oh, he's going to throw us in the abyss. We're going to be tormented. Hey, Jesus, can we go into those swine? And it says immediately he gave him permission. Yeah, go ahead. Wow. Now there's something else here. After Jesus had commanded them to come out, afterwards, that's what it says. He says to them, what is your name? Now again, this goes back to the idea of names in the Bible. He didn't stand up and say, I'm Joel, I'm Sam, I'm John. And all these demons start giving them their names. No. He said, I, singular, am legion, for we are many. You see, the name he was asking when he said, what is your name? He was saying, who are you? What is your reputation? What have you done? Who are you? Not what's your name. He could care less what his name was. It was who was he? And he says, he is we. We are many. And there was 2,000 swine, and they went out into the 2,000 swine. Now, legion, and where is it in here? I'm going to find it just a minute. Oh, here it is. The demon said his name was Legion. This was not just a name, but described who he was. A legion was a body of soldiers whose number differed at different times. And at the time of Augustus, I'm going to have to quit writing these things. But anyway, in the time of Augustus, it got to be Augustus, the Caesar Augustus, it seems to have consisted of 6,826 men. A legion of Roman soldiers was made up of 6,100 foot soldiers and 726 horsemen. So when Jesus asked him, who are you? What is your name? He said, we are a legion. We are a legion of soldiers, warriors. And if we use the numbering from Augustus, who was the emperor at that time, it would be 6,826 demons. Now that is a lot of demons. You want to know why he could break chains and shatter shackles and everybody was afraid to even walk by the tombs? There were 6,800 demons, warrior demons. And we think sometimes when we deal with the world and people who are demon possessed, well, I got a little demon in them, we can just take it out of there. I have not, in all the demons I've cast out, I have yet to find one. I've always found more. There are always more. And they don't all come out at one time sometimes. You'll have one come out and you're thinking, oh, you got the demon out? No. You keep, pretty soon another one will come out, and then they all come out. And when they all come out, you know they've all come out. But this is how Satan controls this world. This is how he goes about doing what he does, is through his demons. And they're warrior demons. And don't ever kid yourself. You can't stand up against the warrior demons unless you are completely covered in the armor of God and use the authority of the name. The reason that they trembled, the reason that they said, don't command us now before our time, is because Jesus had all the authority to merely speak the word, and they had to obey. There is nothing in this world that is free of the need to command when Jesus speaks. Okay? There's nothing in this world that can stand against the command of Jesus. Nothing. And that's because he has the authority. Now, if we have that authority, which he says we do, and we use his name, he says, whatsoever you do, do all in the name of Jesus. That doesn't mean you go out and say just the word Jesus. It means you are using all of his authority. It means you are using all of his power, and you can command anything to move. That's why he said, if you have faith as a seed of a mustard, you can say to that mountain, move, thrown into the sea. Why? Because if Jesus wanted the mountain moved and thrown into the sea, all he had to do was command the mountain to be thrown in the sea. Could you see Jesus doing that? I saw him walk up to a fig tree that didn't have fruit and say he cursed the fig tree and come back the next morning, he was dead. I saw him stop his hurricane. Does it take more to do that than to cause a mountain to be thrown into the sea? I mean, he created it all, right? You know, we hear this and we read this and we understand the power of Jesus, and we even understand that we should have that same power, but we don't. And why not? Is it because we try to do it in ourselves? Is it because we have limited God in our concept of what God is capable of doing through us? But I am just me. He didn't limit what he could do based on who we are. No, nowhere. He said, these signs shall follow them that believe. Not unless you're male, unless you're female, unless you're old, unless you're young, unless you're redhead, unless you're blonde, unless you're 6'4", unless you're 5'9". There's nothing in there that limits what God can do for anybody or through anybody that lets him do it. Faith merely means trust. Number one, trust that God will do it. And secondly, that it lines up with what God has for you. He can do anything. Okay. Now, he gave them permission. They went out, jumped into the pigs. Out into the sea the pigs went, and that was the end of the pigs. They all drowned. 2,000 pigs. So, the whole city came out to Jesus. In fact, even from the countryside, to see when they heard the pig keeper's story. These pig keepers were out there feeding the pigs. You see, this was not Israel, so there was no prohibition against pigs. Swine, you could eat it. The people, this was a big farm, or ranch, if you will, for pigs, and it was one of their big exports from that region were swine. And Rome in particular, they all ate pork and different pork things. I'm sure they had figured out how to do pork barbecues and spare ribs and all that good stuff that we don't like. Um, and so this was a big deal. I mean, 2,000 pigs. It must have put a big dent in the export market, economically. And I've heard preachers, in fact, the book that I'm using kind of is the outline or the straw horse for this series. It even calls this the oppression of the economic, thing, because they came out and told him to leave. And I've heard preachers say, well, because he affected their economics. I don't think so. I don't think so. It says in here that they were afraid. They all came out and they were afraid. And they were even more afraid when they came out and they saw the demoniac man, that they couldn't keep chains on, couldn't keep clothes on. I mean, this guy's stark naked running around, and they couldn't walk past where he was. And here he is, sitting there at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and a bunch of people. And he's sitting there just like them. Why, we've tried everything. We've had every doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist. We've tried shock treatments. We've tried chains and shackles. We've tried having soldiers chained to him. We have tried everything to control this guy. And here he is just sitting there like everybody else. They were afraid. When Jesus does extraordinary things, it brings fear. When we do extraordinary things, it brings fear. Or it should bring fear, okay, to those who do not understand the power and where it comes from. This isn't type stuff, It is. It's just plain the Word of God. And Jesus was our example. And when he did things, you saw what happened. The same thing should happen when we do it. People should fear us. People should, they should have this. and they became so terrified that they asked him to leave. Just go. We don't want you here. We don't know what you'll do next. I mean, if you're going to wipe out the swine, you're going to cast the demons out of this guy that we can't handle, we don't need you here. Just go away. And there may have been some concern for their idols and their gods, I mean, if this guy can do that, what could he do to our gods, to our whole religious system, to everything that we are? And it's interesting, Jesus left. You see, he made that whole trip. He went through the hurricane on the lake, over to the other side, Decapolis, to cast a demon out of a man. Turn around, head back. I don't know about you, but I look at that and I say, he knew, of course, before he left what was going to happen. He was God, he knew everything that was happening, going to happen. And yet still, there's a multitude waiting for him. There's a multitude that want to hear his teaching, want to have healings and all of that, fame and everything over here. He leaves all of that and goes all the way over here to deliver one man. What does that tell us about God? We see the same thing with Philip. Philip is preaching a mighty revival. The whole town is being, this is a huge revival. You read it in the scriptures. It was a huge thing going on. This town was all being saved. The city, they were all coming to hear Philip. And God called him and said, hey, Philip, I want you to go out there on that road and walk down the road and wait for a chariot to come by. Chariot came by, he got up on it, talked to him, baptized the guy, and the Spirit took him someplace else. He left a mighty revival to talk to one eunuch. See, that's the way Jesus is. He tells the parable of the 90 and 9. We'll get into that later. He says the shepherd had 100 sheep. 99 were in the fold, one was missing. He went out and got the one sheep. the gospel is based not on the multitudes, it's based on the ones. You know, and we look at it, we don't really see that sometimes, we don't really catch that, but it's based on the ones. It's the one today that God wants to save. It's the one today, and the reason he wants to save him is because he has put himself in some kind of a position. It's that one person that needs God today. And that's the way we have to look at how we grow things, how we disciple, how we talk to people. It's the one. It's not standing on a corner and trying to reach 500 people that walk by you, or getting up the stage in a big arena and having 500 come to the front. I mean, that's good. I'm not putting any of that down. But what happens after they come down? Now, I was privileged to work with Billy Graham in a couple of his crusades. And I can tell you what happens when you come down to a Billy Graham crusade. There may be 1,000 people come down to the front. You know what? There's 1,000 people waiting for them, with books in their hands, Bibles, and they take them over to the side. They sign them up for a Bible course. They go through the Word right there, what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they can expect next. There's somebody that knocks on their door within 2 days. From a local church, whatever address they're in, they have, I think it's 2 to 3 days. They better be knocking on that person's door, talking to them, getting them to church, planting them in the church. It may be big, huge crusades and you see the thousands, but what you find in the background is the ones. Ones. And that's what it takes in the kingdom of God, is the ones. You see, Jesus pointed this out. The demoniac said, hey, I want to go with you. You've done such a great thing, I want to go with you. Jesus said, no. You go back home and you tell everybody. You tell them what happened to you. And it says he went through the city. He told people all over the city and all over the country, all through Decapolis. This man went around saying, let me tell you what Jesus did for me. See, that's the way the kingdom works. Ones. Okay, so we got in the boat. Uneventful trip back across the lake as far as we know. So, came back to Capernaum. And here, we're going to talk now for the next couple of things here on returning to Capernaum and meeting his opponents with a group of outstanding miracles. Matthew 9, verses 18 to 19. While he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 24. Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 42. So it was, when Jesus returned, that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was the ruler of the synagogue. And he fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. So here Jesus comes back to the other side. And what's waiting for him but the multitude? Now it was evening when he left. They went through the hurricane to the other side, cast the demons out of the demoniac, and returned back. It was about 32 miles around the lake, if you went around the lake, and it's about, I think, about 8 miles across the lake. Now, I don't know how long it takes to get there in a sailboat. You know, I'm not a sailor, but I presume it takes a bit of time to cover that much ground. So it was probably dark when he got back. And what did he find waiting for him but the multitude? Now, I like that. I like that because he set off in a boat to go to the other side, and the people said, he's going to be coming back someday. He didn't say, now I'm going to go over there, I'll be back in 3 hours, so you just wait here, I'll be back in 3 hours. He didn't tell them when he was coming back, he didn't even tell them if he was coming back, and yet here was the multitude at the seashore waiting for him to get back. Wouldn't it be nice if people today were so concerned and anxious to hear the words of Jesus that they would be there? In fact, wouldn't it be nice if people were so concerned to hear the Word of God that they'd be here at 9:30, 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday mornings, instead of starting service with 15 people in the sanctuary and everybody finally decides to filter in? Oops.
Yeah, it was pretty sad yesterday morning.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I don't even know if there was 15.
Maybe not.
You know. But you see, these people had a hunger to hear what Jesus had to say. Shouldn't we have a hunger to hear what Jesus has to say today? Shouldn't we have a hunger to be in His presence? Shouldn't we have a hunger to see what He's going to do and wants to do? The multitude could not have known when Jesus would return, but they were all waiting and looking for Him. And notice what it says. When the boat touched the shore, they all welcomed Him. There wasn't this, oh, here He comes, I'm going to sit through another 3 hours of lesson. Oh, man. Hurry up and get to the healing and quit your talking so much. No, they wanted to hear Him and see what He would do. Now, the English is Jairus. Actually, it's pronounced Iarios. Iarios in Hebrew. Or Greek, Greek. Iarios. Now, this guy was a ruler of the synagogue. So and that means he was an elder. And it was his job to take care of the synagogue. You should remember, we've talked about they had the temple. Temple had priests, and the synagogue had elders. So he may or may not have been a Levite. That was not a requirement for the synagogue. His job was to take care of the synagogue. He was a ruler of the synagogue. I kind of look at it today as maybe being the head usher in the church. And not in our church, because we don't use the usher system like some of the older churches do. But in fact, I had a lady in my class, we just finished up at the university. She's a Baptist lady, happened to be a black Baptist preacher's wife. But she came out of Pentecost, so we had a lot in common. We talked a lot. But we were talking on one of the breaks and kind of laughing about the older ways of doing things. But I went to a church in Chicago, and this was back 50 years ago, back in the 60s, late 60s. And this thing was called the First Church of Deliverance. Now, as far as I know, it's still there, and I looked it up on the internet one night, and they're still there. But they had a Sunday night service at midnight. Every Sunday night, midnight, you can go to service. And this was a special service. It was on the radio. They had 500 in their choir. Now you can imagine 500 Spirit-filled black choir members with 2 Hammond organs, one on each side, up in the middle of the singer here with these 2 organs. They would fire those things up, and I mean that church would come unglued. They could sing, man, they would sing, and they put this whole thing on for about, maybe 30 minutes. There was nothing but music. And they would sing, and man, I mean, but before everything started, I was laughing with her, and I said, yeah, I went there, and the ushers all had on gray suits and gray gloves. Everything was so perfect. And they walked down the aisle, and they would escort the pastoral team to the platform and seat them, and come back and sit there. But if you were nodding off, and how you could do it, I don't know, but some of those folks, it was hot. This was back in Chicago in the summertime, and it was hot in there. I mean, hot, people were passing out. I mean, I'm serious. It was serious hot in that building. And all this stuff's going on. The ushers would walk kind of down the aisle, and they'd see somebody sleeping. They'd usher them out. You did not fall asleep in that church. Or if you got to cutting up, there was a couple of good-sized boys come over and quiet you down in a hurry. You see, that was kind of the way I look at this ruler of the synagogue. He made sure everything was done in proper order, everything was done right, and there was mostly a lot of reading in the synagogue, and so the scrolls had to be kept, and all of that. So that's what he was doing. But he was considered a prominent person in the community, elder in the synagogue. And here he comes up while Jesus is addressing this multitude that had been waiting for him. Because Jesus, as soon as he stepped out of the boat, or if he even got out of the boat, I don't know, he probably began talking to them and teaching. That's what they came for. But he interrupted him because the situation he found himself in was critical. I've got a daughter who's dying. And he wasn't afraid to stop Jesus from what he was doing in order to ask that he take care of his situation. And what was it he wanted Jesus to do? He wanted Jesus to go home with him. I need you to go to my house because I've got a daughter who's dying. Now there's a difference here in the two versions. Matthew, again, differs from both Mark and Luke. Because Matthew says that what Ariel said was, my daughter has just died, but come here, lay your hand on her, and she will live. And did we read this yet?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Read. Okay,
Yes.
I'm getting old. And the other two say, my little daughter lies at the point of death. And then Luke says, for he only had one daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. Now, Matthew says she was dead. The other two said she was dying. Well, that's easy to explain because Matthew does not give us any detail here. He merely points to the fact that the girl had died. What was the most important part of the whole message? The girl had died. In a minute, we're going to find out that as Jesus was going to the house, they came and told him she was dead. He leaves that part out. Matthew does not talk about the servant coming or how Ariel found out that his daughter was dead. Okay. It's the same any way you look at it. She was dead by the time Jesus got there. Okay. So again, it's the style of the writers and what they felt was important that they were pointing out here. So, here he is. He asked him to go with him. So Jesus agrees to go with Aeos. And what does he do? Well, he takes off on the journey to go to this man's house. Now, how far it was to his house, we don't know. He was by the seashore. Capernaum was not very far away. And it was no doubt the synagogue at Capernaum was probably where this man was the ruler. That would be close. Matthew 9:20 to 22 talks about an event that happens on the way to Arius' house. Matthew. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. Now, very short, doesn't tell us much detail, only that this woman was healed. Now Mark, he gives us a little different view. It says, now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around to the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Luke 8, 43 to 48. Now a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any, came from behind and touched the border of his garment. And immediately her flow of blood stopped. And Jesus said, who touched me? When all denied it, Peter and those with him said, Master, the multitudes throng and press you, and you say, who touched me? But Jesus said, somebody touched me, for I perceive power going out from me. Now when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him and how she was healed immediately. And he said to her, daughter, be of good cheer, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Now here's Jesus heading for Jairus' house, and no doubt in a bit of a hurry, but really being impeded by the multitude. Fighting his way, making his way through the multitude. He was not standing still, as far as we know, unless he had a real traffic jam there. He was moving along, moving through the crowd, and here comes this woman with an issue of blood. Had it for 12 years. Now there's some interesting things about this story. This woman had tried everything possible to find healing. She had tried everything. All of her money, all the physicians, everything that she could find to do, she tried, and nothing had worked. Now this woman was in the crowd, in the multitude. Now she wasn't supposed to be there, because according to Jewish law, she was unclean and therefore forbidden by the law to be in the crowd. So before she could touch the hem of the garment of Jesus, she had to break the law. Oh, wait a minute. You mean, now wait a minute, that's not good. Breaking the law, that's not good. But before she could get healed, she had to break away from the law. You see, in this whole series of miracles and parables here, we find one recurring theme all the way through. from the disciple that wanted to go bury his dead man, to the man in the tombs, to the demons, to the whole thing. The idea is the law, the outward appearance, has to be broken, and you have to leave those things behind in order to find what God has for you, because He alone is life. And so she broke the law. She went into the crowd. She risked being stoned to death. To her, this wasn't just another attempt at healing. She tried everything, nothing worked. But this was not just another attempt. She put her life on the line. If a member of the Levites, a Pharisee, had seen her in the crowd, she was unclean, they could take her out and stone her right there. She broke the law. So this was not, you see, her faith was not based on just a word. It was not based on just some statement of faith. It was based on real action. Yeah. If it doesn't work, I'm dead. They'll stone me. It also meant she had to be rather quick. Get in the crowd and get to Jesus. Because if she got caught before, she'd never make it. So here she was, in the crowd. She comes up behind Jesus and touched the hem of his robe, the bottom. Now, in order to do that, she had to be down on the ground. Unless she was pretty short. Reached down. Now, Jesus is moving, and she comes up behind him. Now, either she got down on her hands and knees and crawled real fast to keep up with him, or she came down and just fell at his behind him and touched the hem of his garment as she went down. The thing about this woman was she was sure that if she could just touch his garment, just touch his garment, that she'd be healed. And sometimes we have the mistaken idea that in order to get healing from God or anything from God, we have to crawl across broken glass. We have to, run around the block 5 times, fast for 6 weeks. We have a whole thing in our minds that says this is what we have to do in order to get something from God. No. It's as simple as touching the hem of his garment. But we have to be willing to put everything on the line in order to touch that garment. Faith says it doesn't matter about anything else. The only thing that matters is I touch him. Not that I have to get in front of him, put a big stop sign up, put a big sign up, Jesus, turn around and see me. She probably thought he would not even know that she had touched him. She had no concept of what would happen when she touched him. But as soon as she did, Jesus stopped. If we're going to stop Jesus, just touch him. Just touch him. That's all it takes. He turned around. And he said, "Who touched me?" And you can't expect anything any different. But those in the crowd didn't know what he was talking about. His disciples didn't get it. They heard it, but they didn't hear it. They didn't get it. It didn't ring with them. Logically saying, he's being jostled around by all of these people going down the road, and he suddenly says, "Who touched me?" That by now they should know he's not a screwball. Something extraordinary must have happened. And Jesus said, "I felt the power go out of me." Now, not all of his power went out. That's not what he meant. I like the old King James. It says, he felt the virtue go out of him. That healing power went out of him. I remember, well, a lot of the old healers that used to go around the tent meetings, you know, Oral Roberts and A.A. Allen and all the different ones. Almost every one of them, as they would pray for the sick, would become weaker and weaker and weaker. And some of them I've seen, they actually had a chair. I've seen Oral Roberts many times. They'd bring a chair out and he'd sit down in the chair because he couldn't stand up anymore. And he said the reason is because of power. When he's healing, he just feels that power and it just goes out of him, and pretty soon his whole body is just rag. And I know preaching sometimes is that way. Sometimes here on Monday nights, she drives home. Because by the time I get done, I'm just, not always, most of the time. You see, when you allow God to use you and that power goes through, whether it's anointing for healing, preaching, teaching, whatever it may be, if you allow that to flow, it takes some of your strength out with it. And Jesus was no different. He was human. And so he felt that leave. But when she touched him, she knew she was healed in her body. It wasn't a mental thing. She felt it. She knew she was healed. Now she tried to hide, probably because she feared for her life. She was still considered unclean. She had not been to the priest to be washed and declared clean. And so she hid. I mean, if everybody sees me, and they'll know, she may have had a cloak over her head, you know, so nobody would recognize her, you know. And she was hiding. But when she realized that Jesus found her and knew who she was, then she gave her testimony. Then she said, this is the whole story. This is who I am. This is who I have been. This is what has been wrong with me. But today, I have been healed. And notice this, what Jesus said. He said, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. In all three cases, he says basically the same thing. Well, just two of them, not Matthew. Yes, he does too. Has made you well. We sometimes are made well, but we're not healed. What do you mean by that? How many times have you had people, oh, I had some disease and I've been healed of that and everything clears up, and a year later it comes back? Were you healed of it, or were you made well? You see, her faith made her well. But if you go in peace, you'll be healed. What does that mean? God heals, and Jesus heals us, but sometimes we go, and it's a constant fear. Is that going to come back? Is that going to come back? Oh, I got an ache. Is that coming back again? I better go get an x-ray. I better go get an MRI. I better have a blood test. Is that coming back again? You see, we're not at peace when God heals us. And fear that it will come back will cause it to come back. It's not, the faith is healing, but we also have to have faith that we live in peace about that. It's taken care of. Not just today, but tomorrow. All right. So, he goes on down the road, he comes to Jairus' house. Matthew 9:23-26. When Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, he said to them, make room, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping, and they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in, took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went out into all that land. Mark chapter 5, verses 35-43. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he went to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered in where the child was laying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. And in Luke chapter 8, verses 49 to 56, while he was still speaking, someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, "Your daughter is dead, do not trouble the teacher." But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well." When he came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, "Do not weep, she is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately, and he commanded that she be given something to eat. And her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. All right, so he's on the road, he's coming along. Here comes the servant that tells Irios that his daughter is dead. And immediately, before Irios had time to become afraid or to react to the news, Jesus turned around and said, "Hey, don't listen to him. Just have faith, believe, just believe, and your daughter's going to be fine." Didn't give him a chance to react. Didn't give him a chance to build up unbelief. So then Jesus turned around and he said, I only want, there's a whole multitude, and 12 disciples. He said, "I just want Peter, James, and John to come with me. The rest of you stay here. I don't even want you to go with me. Just stay here." So he stops the multitude, he stops the procession, and here he goes, Peter, James, John, and Irios, and they head for Irios' house. And when they get there, here's this big tumultuous thing. The flutes are playing. You know, they'd hired all of these professional mourners. Now, how they got there so fast, when the girl had just died, I don't know. But evidently they had them all ready because they were assured she was going to die. And they wanted them there. As soon as she was dead, they wanted all of the ceremony to kick into gear, and let's get this thing moving. So Jesus comes in, here's all this mess. I mean, they're wailing, they're bawling, they're playing, there's all this noise. And he says, "Why are you doing this? She is just asleep." And they all ridiculed him. How often do you have people ridicule you when you show faith? First thing people want to do is ridicule. "Oh, that can't be. You're all crazy." Notice what Jesus did. He put all the unbelief outside the house. He got rid of all of their unbelief. The mourning was a sign of unbelief. The multitude was a sign of unbelief. Got them all out. "I don't want you here. Leave." Closed the door. And he took the parents, Peter, James, and John, and he went into the room where the little girl was lying, dead. Now, I don't believe she was just sleeping. I believe she was dead. When Jesus referred to him sleeping, he also referred to Lazarus as being asleep. You know, he'd been dead 4 days. It was in the eyes of Jesus she was sleeping. To the multitude she was dead. But to him, she was just asleep. And took him by the hand. And the words that he spoke here, by the way, the Talitha cumi, that was the language that Jesus spoke part of the time. It's called the Syro-Chaldaic, or a mixture of Syriac and Chaldee languages. And he spoke that often. It's written in several of his sayings were actually written in that language. Why he used it here, I don't know. But it's translated correctly, and that is "damsel arise." It's the simplest term for his "damsel arise," or "little girl rise up." And he took her by the hand, raised her up, and then he did an interesting thing. He commanded that they not let anybody know about it. Now, how in the world are you not going to let anybody know about it when this girl was dead and now she's alive? But you see, he'd already set in motion when he told them she's just sleeping. He didn't say, she's dead, but you all don't have to do this anymore. I'm going to raise her up from the dead. He just said she's asleep, so he came in and woke her up. Something that they didn't know how to do. All right? So he came from being a great miracle worker to all of those out there to being a very smart physician. Big difference, right? Okay. So he had set the stage, and then he said, don't tell anybody. And then the next thing he did is kind of astonishing. He said, give her something to eat. You see, he met the spiritual side of this. She was dead, but there was a physical side that needed food. She'd probably been ill for some time and maybe had not eaten anything for a long time. So the ultimate test, you know when you've been sick for a long time, you don't walk in and jam a ham sandwich in somebody's face. Right? You know, you have a little clear liquid and finally some soup, you know, and he just said, get her some food. In other words, get her a sandwich. Man, slam it in her face. And she ate it with no problem. That was the ultimate test. She was indeed alive. All right, move on quickly. Healing the two blind men, Matthew 9, chapter 9, verses 27 to 31. When Jesus departed from there, two blind men followed him, crying out and saying, Son of David, have mercy on us. And when he had come into the house, the blind men came to him. And Jesus said to them, do you believe that I am able to do this? And they said to him, yes, Lord. Then he touched their eyes, saying, according to your faith, let it be to you. And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, see that no one knows it. When he had departed, they spread the news about him in all the country. You see, Jesus again had this thing. Don't tell anybody. Now he did this on several occasions. He had already healed blind men, lame men, sick people, and everything else. And all of a sudden he said, I don't want you to tell anybody about this. Now I don't know why, and I'll be honest, and I haven't seen too many commentaries that can tell you why either. They all have ideas, I guess. But we do know this story, that they followed him crying out for mercy. But he did not heal them until he had come into the house, and they came into him evidently privately. Probably his disciples with him. And then he healed them. And notice their healing was according to their faith. Interesting. All right, last thing we're going to look at is the restoring a dumb demoniac and the blasphemous charge that was repeated against Jesus here. Matthew 9, 32 to 34. As they went out, behold, they brought to him a man mute and demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke, and the multitudes marveled, saying, it was never seen like this in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demons by the ruler of the demons. So, here following the two blind men that he didn't want anybody to know about, here comes a demoniac who is also mute. Now, there used to be, probably some people still feel this way, that if somebody is mute or has sickness, it's a demon possessed. But notice this doesn't say he was mute because of a demon. It says he was a dumb man or mute and was demon possessed. So mute, being mute or unable to speak is not necessarily a sign of demon possession. It could be a physical thing. The same, they used to think that if you were, had certain mental problems, you were demon possessed. That's not always the case. The mind can malfunction just like any other part of the body. And so you have people who have mental problems. They need healing. They don't need to be delivered of a demon always. And quite often there are demons involved, but that's not a prerequisite, okay? The multitude, after he had healed the man and he spoke, the multitude were marveled that he spoke. It wasn't so much that he cast the demon out. Now, on the other side of the lake, it was the casting the demon out. Here, it was that he spoke. And the multitude, they all seem to agree that nothing like this had ever been done in Israel. And of course, here come the Pharisees, and they took the opportunity to once again accuse Jesus of using the power of the prince of demons to cast out demons. It's interesting, the multitude dwelt on the healing of the dumb. The Pharisees dwelt on the idea he cast out a demon. Two different looks. And we could go into that, but we're not going to. I'm actually done early, did you notice that? And we started quite late, so I managed to hold it under 2 hours. That's pretty good. Do you have any questions, comments, questions, observations? Nothing? All right, then that's it for tonight. Thank you. And next week we will continue.